My name is Laurel, and I am 72 years old. For the last 45 of those years, my world began and ended with my husband, Arthur. When he passed, a part of my own landscape just vanished. All I had left of him were the memories, and the tangible weight of those memories, which he had so lovingly curated for me in velvet-lined boxes. My late husband's jewelry collection. It wasn't a hoard of treasure in the way a dragon might keep it. It was a story, our story, told in gold and diamond, sapphire and pearl. Each piece was a chapter, a milestone, a quiet Tuesday made brilliant. And I knew my grandson was going to steal it. The phone call came yesterday from a Detective Miller, a name I will never forget. His voice was professionally gentle, the kind of voice that delivers bad news for a living. He told me they had arrested Kyle, my Kyle, and his girlfriend Tiffany. They had caught them red-handed, not in my house, but in a pawn shop downtown, trying to sell what the detective called a significant collection of high-end jewelry. My heart did a painful little flip-flop in my chest, a nauseating mix of gut-wrenching sorrow and the cold, clean click of a plan coming perfectly to fruition. I let out a shaky breath, a sound I had practiced in the mirror, and I asked the detective, in the quavering voice of a terrified old woman, "My jewelry, oh God, is it all gone?" He assured me they had recovered every piece. I thanked him, my voice cracking with a grief that was both completely real and a perfect lie. Because the truth is, I had been waiting for this call for 6 agonizing weeks, and the jewelry they'd recovered? It was worthless, beautiful, brilliant, and utterly, flawlessly fake. This wasn't just a story about theft. It was the story of how I laid a trap to save the boy I loved from the monster that was eating him alive, and how, in doing so, I had to become a different kind of monster myself. It started, as these things so often do, with the small things. A $20 bill missing from the little ceramic dish where I keep my grocery money, then a 50 from my purse. At first, I chided myself. Senility. Laurel, you're getting forgetful. You probably used it for gas. But the forgetfulness became a pattern. My silver butter knives, the ones with the little rose pattern on the handle that my own mother had given me, vanished. I asked Kyle about them, my voice casual, trying not to sound accusatory. He was living with me then, supposedly to help me out around the house after Arthur passed. In reality, I knew he and Tiffany had nowhere else to go. He couldn't meet my eyes. He mumbled something about maybe I'd put them in a different drawer. His hands were trembling slightly. That was the first time I saw it, really saw it, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, even though the house was cool, the pupils that were just a little too small, the hollowness behind his eyes that had replaced the light I remembered from his childhood. He was 24, but he looked 40. He was my boy, my beautiful boy, the one I practically raised, because his own mother, my daughter Susan, was always too wrapped up in her own dramas to be a consistent parent. I was the one who taught him to ride a bike, who held a cool cloth to his forehead when he was sick, who clapped the loudest at his high school graduation. And now, standing in my kitchen, he was a stranger in a familiar body. His girlfriend, Tiffany, was worse. She was a ghost who floated through my house, all sharp angles and defensive energy. If I asked her a question, she'd flinch. She'd offer to help with the dishes, and I'd notice a silver salt shaker gone the next day. They thought I didn't see. They thought I was just a sad old woman, lost in my grief, too blind to notice the pieces of my life being chipped away and sold for pennies on the dollar. The breaking point wasn't even about something valuable. It was a small, sterling silver locket. It was tarnished and had a tiny dent on one side where I'd dropped it on our honeymoon. Inside was a ridiculously small picture of Arthur, looking young and silly, and a matching one of me with a terrible haircut. It was worth maybe $30 in scrap silver, but to me, it was priceless. One afternoon, I went to put it on, and it was gone from my dresser tray. I didn't even have to ask. I knew. I walked into the living room, where Kyle and Tiffany were watching television, their faces bathed in the flickering blue light, and I just looked at them. I didn't say a word. Kyle shifted on the sofa, suddenly unable to get comfortable. Tiffany stared defiantly at the screen. The silence in that room was louder than any accusation. That night, I went into my bedroom, closed the door, and I finally allowed myself to break. I sat on the edge of my bed, the same bed I had shared with Arthur for nearly 5 decades, and I wept. It was a horrible, guttural kind of crying that came from a place so deep inside me, I didn't know it existed. It was a grief, not just for my husband, but for my grandson, for the boy he used to be, for the trust that had been corroded as surely as cheap metal. My daughter Susan called the next day. She must have spoken to Kyle. Her voice was sharp, accusatory. "Mom, you have to stop. You're going to push him away completely." I was still raw from the night before. "Push him away, Susan. He's stealing from me. He stole the locket Arthur gave me." "Oh, Mom, don't be so dramatic," she sighed, a sound of pure, practiced impatience. "He probably just misplaced it. You know how you are these days. And even if he did take it, it's because they're struggling. They're just kids. You have more than you need. Why can't you just help them?" The injustice of it was like a physical blow. I was the one who had helped. I had helped her when she was a teenager, helped her through her divorce, helped her raise her own son when she decided she needed to find herself. And now I was being painted as the villain for not wanting my home to be picked clean by 2 people in the grip of a sickness she refused to name. "It's not about the money, Susan," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "It's about the addiction." "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare label him. He's just having a hard time. He needs love and support, not judgment." She hung up on me. I stood there in my silent kitchen, the receiver buzzing in my ear, and I felt a profound and terrifying clarity. No one was coming to help. Susan was a willing participant in his self-destruction, wrapping his addiction in the soft, smothering blanket of her denial. If I called the police over a locket, he'd get a slap on the wrist. He'd hate me, Susan would disown me, and nothing would fundamentally change. He would just get smarter about his stealing. My gaze drifted to the portrait of Arthur on the mantelpiece, and my mind went straight to the jewelry box in my closet. It wasn't just a box. It was a heavy mahogany chest with a brass lock, and inside lay our entire life together. The first piece he ever gave me was a simple gold band with a tiny diamond chip. He bought it with his first real paycheck from the engineering firm. He was so proud, his hand shaking as he slipped it on my finger. He said it was a down payment on a lifetime of beautiful things, and he kept his promise. There was the Art Deco sapphire ring. He'd gotten a huge promotion, the one that finally allowed us to buy this house. We went out to a fancy dinner to celebrate, and I'd been admiring a ring in the window of a shop we passed. I thought nothing of it. Halfway through dessert, he slid the box across the table. The sapphire was the color of the evening sky, flanked by tiny, glittering diamonds. When I look at it, I can still smell the steak and wine, still feel the rough linen of the napkin in my lap, still see the absolute adoration in his eyes. That ring wasn't just a ring. It was the down payment on this house, the celebration of a life we were building brick by brick. Then there were the pearls, a classic 3-strand necklace. He gave them to me in the hospital, the day Kyle was born. Susan was only 19, terrified and overwhelmed. I was the one who stayed with her through 20 hours of labor. After Kyle was finally here, sleeping in a little plastic bassinet, Arthur came into the room. He looked at me, exhausted and frazzled, and said, "You were a mother again today." He fastened the pearls around my neck. They were cool against my skin. He said they represented the three of us, him, me, and now Susan, a family forever linked. When I held those pearls, I felt the weight of that promise. And finally, there was the last piece. A simple, heavy gold bracelet. He gave it to me about a month before he died. We knew the end was coming. He was so weak, his magnificent, capable hands reduced to fragile claws. He couldn't fasten the clasp himself. I had to do it. He watched me, his eyes cloudy with medication, but still so full of love. He touched the bracelet on my wrist. "Don't ever let these things go for anything less than your life, Laurel," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "They are our life. Every piece is a memory. As long as you have them, you have me." Sitting there in my kitchen, after that brutal phone call with Susan, his words echoed in my head. Don't ever let them go. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that Kyle and Tiffany were coming for them. The small things were just practice. The jewelry box was the grand prize. The thought of them taking that box, of pawning our life for a few $100s to feed their habit, it was unthinkable. It would be the final desecration. It would be like losing Arthur all over again. And that's when the idea began to form. It was a cold, hard, terrible little seed in the fertile soil of my desperation. I couldn't stop them from trying to steal the jewelry. But what if the jewelry they stole wasn't the jewelry at all? What if I could build a rock bottom so hard, so absolute, that it would finally break their fall? It wasn't about revenge. Not then. I told myself it was about rescue. It was the hardest, most brutal form of love I could imagine. I would have to sacrifice my image as the loving, gentle grandmother. I would have to become a strategist. I would have to be willing to let them fall, praying to God that the net I was weaving would catch them at the very last moment. The decision settled over me, not with peace, but with the grim resolve of a general planning, a battle they know will cost them dearly. The first step was the hardest. I had to accept that my home was no longer a sanctuary, but a stage for a slow-motion robbery. For about a week, I wrestled with alternatives. I went online and researched high-grade home safes. I even had a man from a security company come to the house. He was a nice young man who walked through my rooms and talked about bolt-down capabilities and fire ratings. But as he spoke, I pictured Kyle and Tiffany, desperate and strong with that awful drug-fueled energy, ripping the safe right out of the wall, destroying the floorboards, tearing apart the closet where Arthur's old suit still hung. The collateral damage was too high. Then I considered a safe deposit box at the bank. It was the most logical solution, but logic wasn't the only factor here. If I simply moved the collection, they would eventually notice it was gone. They would tear the house apart looking for it. They would become more erratic, more dangerous, and ultimately, it wouldn't force the confrontation they so desperately needed. It would just postpone it. No, the answer had to be more elegant, more final. It had to be a trap that they would walk into willingly, a trap they would bait for themselves. The idea of replicas, once a fleeting, crazy thought, now seemed like the only viable path. It was a plan with two objectives: to protect Arthur's legacy and to create a situation so legally catastrophic for Kyle that the system, the police, the courts would have no choice but to intervene in a way I never could. He wouldn't just be a petty thief who stole from his grandma. He would be a fraudster who committed a serious felony against a business. That, I learned from my late-night internet research, was a different category of crime altogether. Finding the right person for the job was crucial. This couldn't be done at a mall kiosk. I needed an artist, a craftsman from another era. I found him in a part of the city I hadn't visited in years. The shop was called Abramov and Sons. Though the sign was so faded, it was clear the Sons had long since moved on. The windows were dusty, displaying a few lonely-looking silver tea sets. Inside, the air smelled of metal polish and old paper. A tiny bell tinkled as I entered. A man emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He was small and bald, with a magnificent white mustache and eyes magnified by a pair of thick lens glasses. This was Mr. Abramov. He looked at me. A well-dressed woman of a certain age clutching a large handbag to her chest, and his expression was one of gentle curiosity. "Good afternoon, madam. How may I help you?" His voice was soft, with a faint, unplaceable European accent. My own voice felt tight in my throat. This was the moment of truth. I was about to entrust my most precious secrets to a total stranger. I opened my handbag and took out the Art Deco sapphire ring. I placed it on the velvet tray on his counter. He picked it up with a pair of tweezers, his movements precise and economical. He peered at it through a loop that seemed to be a permanent extension of his eye. He didn't say anything about its value. He just hummed softly, "A beautiful design. Classic." The sentiment here, it is very strong. His words disarmed me. He didn't see a price tag. He saw a story. I took a deep breath, and the whole story just poured out of me. Not the specifics of Kyle and the addiction, but the core of it. I told him I needed to protect a collection of immense sentimental value from a complicated family situation. I told him I wanted to create identical copies of every single piece. He listened without interruption, his head tilted slightly. When I finally ran out of words, he looked from the ring to my face. His magnified eyes were surprisingly kind. "You wish to build a beautiful lie, madam," he said, not with judgment, but with understanding. "A lie to protect a truth." "Yes," I whispered, relief washing over me. "That's exactly it." The next week, I brought him the entire collection. It felt like a betrayal, laying Arthur's love out on a stranger's counter. Mr. Abramov handled each piece with a reverence that soothed my frayed nerves. He laid them out on a black velvet cloth under a bright lamp. The diamonds glittered, the gold glowed. It was a constellation of my life. "This is not just gold and stone," he said softly, echoing my own thoughts. "This is a life. To do this properly, it will not be inexpensive." We then entered a world I knew nothing about. He explained the science of illusion. For the diamonds, he wouldn't use simple cubic zirconia. He recommended moissanite, a lab-created stone with a fire and brilliance that could fool even a trained eye without sophisticated equipment. For the colored gems, like my big sapphire, he would source high-quality lab-grown sapphires, chemically identical to the real thing. The metal was the trickiest part. To mimic the weight and feel of solid gold, he would cast the pieces in sterling silver, and then apply a heavy, micron-thick layer of 22-karat gold plating. "It will not wear off with casual handling," he assured me. "It will feel right. The weight will be correct. Even the clasps, the little maker's marks, we will replicate everything." The cost was staggering. It would take nearly all of the money Arthur and I had saved for the grand European cruise we were supposed to take for our 50th anniversary, a trip we never got to take. There was a bitter irony in using that money to build an elaborate deception, but it felt right. It was still, in its own way, for Arthur. I was protecting his legacy. I wrote Mr. Abramov a check, my hand steady. The 2 months it took him to complete the work were some of the longest of my life. During that time, the situation at home deteriorated. Kyle and Tiffany were more brazen. A pair of Arthur's cufflinks disappeared from his dresser. A small framed watercolor from the hallway was gone. Each disappearance was a fresh stab of pain, but also a confirmation that my course was the right one. I had to play the part of the oblivious, grieving widow. I would search for the missing items, looking in all the wrong places, calling out to Kyle, "Kyle, dear, have you seen that little painting that used to hang by the stairs?" He'd mumble a no, his eyes flickering away. The lie was heavy in the air between us, thick and suffocating. My daughter Susan continued her campaign of pressure. She'd call every few days. "Mom, Kyle's car needs a new transmission. He can't get to his job interviews without it. Could you just loan him the money?" I knew there were no job interviews. I knew the money would go straight into their habit. I learned to deflect, to be vague. "Oh, Susan, my finances are a bit tight right now. My property taxes are due." The excuses felt flimsy and dishonest, but they were my only shield. My best friend, Carol, was my only outlet. She was a no-nonsense woman who had been my neighbor for 30 years. She thought I was insane. We'd sit on my porch in the evenings, and I'd tell her about my secret project. "Laurel, for heaven's sake, this is madness," she'd say, her knitting needles clicking furiously. "You're spending a fortune to create fake jewelry? Just call the police, get a restraining order, kick them out, and then what, Carol?" I'd ask, my voice weary. "He gets charged with petty theft. He spends a night in jail. He gets probation. His mother bails him out. And he hates me forever. Nothing changes. The addiction is still there. This is the only way to make the consequences big enough to matter. It has to be a felony. It has to be something that forces a judge to offer him the choice between long-term treatment and a real prison sentence." Carol would just shake her head. "It's a terrible gamble, Laurel." "I know," I'd say. "It's the only one I have left." The day Mr. Abramoff called, my heart pounded in my ears. "The work is complete, Mrs. Miller." The next morning, I drove to his shop. He laid out the replicas next to the originals. It was uncanny. I honestly could not tell them apart. The weight, the sparkle, the tiny familiar details, it was all there. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was real now. I paid him the remaining balance, my hands shaking as I wrote the check. The swap was the most nerve-wracking part of the entire ordeal. I took the real collection, nestled in soft cloth bags, to a new safe deposit box I had rented under my name alone. The feel of the cold steel door closing, the definitive thud of the lock, was both a relief and a sorrow. Arthur's memories were safe, but they were also imprisoned. Then I went home, and with trembling fingers, I placed each perfect, beautiful fake into its designated spot in the mahogany jewelry box. I placed the box back in its usual place on the top shelf of my closet behind my winter sweaters. I closed the closet door and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had set the stage. I had baited the trap. Now all I had to do was wait for my grandson to walk into it. The thought made me feel physically ill. The final move had to be mine. I couldn't just wait for it to happen. The timing had to be controlled. I had to give them the opportunity, clear and unambiguous. A week later, I called Susan. I kept my voice light, a little lonely. "Susan, dear, I was thinking of driving up to visit Carol for the weekend. The house just feels so empty lately." I paused, letting the bait dangle. "You know it's silly, but I've been taking out Arthur's old jewelry box at night. Just looking at the pieces, it makes me feel like he's still here with me." I could almost hear the information clicking into place in her mind, ready to be passed on to Kyle. It was a calculated, manipulative act, and it turned my stomach. I was using my love for my husband as a weapon against my own grandson. Oh, that's nice, Mom, Susan said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You should definitely go. A change of scenery will do you good. I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that she would hang up and immediately call Kyle. That Friday, I packed an overnight bag and drove to Carol's house. She greeted me at the door with a hug that was tighter than usual. She knew what this weekend meant. We didn't talk about it directly. We made a pot of soup. We watched an old black and white movie. We sat in her garden and talked about her prize-winning roses. But it was all a performance. Every few minutes, my hand would twitch toward my phone, which sat on the table between us like a little black bomb. I had installed a couple of inexpensive security cameras in my house a few weeks prior, the kind that linked to your phone. I told Kyle they were for my own safety, in case I had a fall. In truth, they were my eyes. Around 9 o'clock that night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I made an excuse to go to the guest room, and I opened the app. My heart leaped into my throat. The living room camera was active. It showed two figures moving through the shadows, Kyle and Tiffany. They used the spare key that I always kept under the ceramic frog by the back door, a key I knew he had copied months ago. They moved with a furtive, nervous energy. They didn't linger. They went straight up the stairs, out of the camera's view. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, my phone clutched in a white-knuckled grip, staring at the empty image of my living room. My imagination filled in the blanks. I saw them in my bedroom, my most private space. I saw them opening my closet, pushing aside my clothes, reaching for the heavy mahogany box. I pictured Kyle's hands, the same hands I used to hold when we crossed the street, closing around that box. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, but the app's timestamp told me it was only 7 minutes. Then they reappeared on the camera, moving quickly toward the back door. Kyle was holding the box. Just before they left, he paused. He looked toward my bedroom doorway, his face caught in the dim security light. For a single heart-stopping moment, he hesitated. His expression was a conflict of guilt and desperation. I saw a flicker of the little boy I knew, and my resolve wavered. A sob caught in my throat. But then Tiffany appeared at his side. She touched his arm, whispered something, and the moment was broken. The hardness returned to his face. They slipped out the back door and were gone. The trap had been sprung. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the dark, replaying that 7-minute video over and over again. The next day, I drove home in a daze. I let myself in through the front door and walked through the silent house. It felt violated. I went upstairs. They had done a clumsy job of making it look like a real robbery. A few drawers were pulled out, some clothes tossed on the floor. It was a teenager's idea of a break-in. But my eyes went straight to the closet. The top shelf was empty. The box was gone. The sight of that empty space, even though I had engineered it, hit me with the force of a physical blow. I steadied myself against the door frame, took a deep, shaky breath, and then I picked up the phone and dialed 911. My voice when I spoke to the dispatcher was a masterpiece of panic grief. I played the part of the hysterical, heartbroken widow to perfection. It was the most honest lie I have ever told. The police were remarkably efficient. 2 uniformed officers arrived, followed by the detective, the one named Miller. He was patient and kind as I walked him through the break-in, my voice catching as I described the stolen jewelry box. It was my husband's. I wept. It was everything he ever gave me. Detective Miller took my statement, his face a mask of professional sympathy. When he asked if I knew anyone who might have done this, I hesitated, playing my part. I hate to say it. I stammered, twisting a tissue in my hands. But my grandson, Kyle, he's been having such a hard time lately. He and his girlfriend. I let the sentence hang in the air. I gave them his name, his address. It felt like a betrayal sharper than any knife. I had pointed the law directly at my own family. The next 48 hours were a blur of silence and dread. Then the call came. But it wasn't from Detective Miller. It was from Susan. She was screaming, a high, thin shriek of pure rage that was painful to hear. How could you do this to him? They arrested him, Mom. They arrested my baby. I held the phone away from my ear, my own heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Susan, he stole from me. He's your grandson, she shrieked. You put him in jail. You set him up, you horrible, vengeful old woman. You'd rather have your stupid trinkets than your own family. She spewed a torrent of blame and hatred that left me speechless. There was no reasoning with her. In her mind, I was the monster. Kyle was the victim. The addiction wasn't a character in this play. It was an invisible force she refused to acknowledge. I listened until she ran out of breath, and then I quietly hung up the phone. The line to my daughter, already frayed, had been decisively cut. My family, what was left of it, had just imploded. Detective Miller called later that day. His tone was different now, less sympathetic, more businesslike. Mrs. Miller, we've recovered your property. Your grandson and his associate attempted to sell it to a pawn shop downtown. The owner got suspicious and called us. It was a smart move on his part. I learned the details later. Kyle and Tiffany, high on their success, had walked into the first pawn shop they could find. The owner, a man named Sal, had been in the business for 40 years. He knew jewelry. They presented him with the entire collection, claiming it was an inheritance, and asked for $10,000. They were so desperate, so jittery, that Sal was immediately on alert. He told them he needed to examine the pieces in the back. He looked at the sapphire ring under his professional loupe. He saw the telltale double refraction of moissanite in the side stones. He performed a simple acid test on an inconspicuous spot on one of the gold chains. It wasn't 18-karat gold. It was silver with a thick plating. He realized he was looking at a set of masterful fakes. Worth something, yes, but not the $100,000 collection they were pretending it was. Kyle had used his own driver's license for the transaction paperwork. Sal took the ID, went to his office, and called the police, telling them he had 2 people in his store attempting to perpetrate a fraud. They had sold our entire life story, or what they thought was our life story, for $5,000 in cash. By the time Detective Miller's office connected my theft report to the pawn shop incident, Kyle and Tiffany were already in custody. The real power shift came a week later. Susan had hired a lawyer for Kyle, a bottom feeder with a cheap suit and shifty eyes. His first move was to try and have the charges dismissed. He called the district attorney's office and claimed it was all a family misunderstanding. This led to a meeting. Me, the assistant district attorney, a sharp young woman named Miss Chen, Susan, and Kyle's lawyer, Mr. Finley. Kyle was not present. We sat around a large table in a sterile conference room. Mr. Finley laid it on thick. My client is a good kid from a good family, he began, gesturing toward Susan, who was already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He's just been under a lot of stress. His grandmother, in her grief, has perhaps become a bit confused. She likely offered him the jewelry, and then forgot she had done so. Miss Chen just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then Susan started. "Mom, please," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears. "Don't do this. He's your grandson. Our family has been through enough. Just tell them you made a mistake. Please, he needs help, not a prison record. Her words, meant to guilt me, had the opposite effect. They ignited a cold, hard anger deep inside me. All this time, she had refused to see the truth. She was still trying to manipulate the situation, to paint me as the confused old woman. The power she had always held over me, the power of being my daughter, the mother of my grandson, was gone. I had spent it, all of it, on a set of beautiful lies. I took a breath and looked directly at Miss. She's right about one thing, I said, my voice as calm and steady as a frozen lake. He does need help. That was the entire point of this. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a folder. I slid it across the table toward the prosecutor. Mr. Finley is mistaken, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even me. I did not give my grandson my jewelry, and he did not, in fact, steal it, because my late husband's jewelry collection is currently sitting in safe deposit box 714 at First National Bank. The silence in the room was absolute. It was as if I had sucked all the air out of it. Susan stared at me, her mouth hanging slightly open. Mr. Finley's smarmy expression dissolved into one of pure, slack-jawed shock. Inside that folder, I continued, you will find the rental agreement for that safe deposit box, dated 2 months ago. You will also find a receipt in the amount of $23,000 from Abramov and Sons, fine jewelers. It is a receipt for the creation of a complete set of museum-quality replicas of every single piece in my collection. The items your pawn shop owner so astutely identified as fakes. Miss Chen opened the folder. She read the documents, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her lips. She understood immediately. The grand larceny charge from my report was now secondary. The primary charge, the one that Sal the pawn shop owner had initiated, was for attempting to defraud a legitimate business. It was a serious felony, and I had just handed her irrefutable proof of premeditation. They hadn't just stolen some jewelry in a moment of desperation. They had taken what they believed to be a fortune and systematically attempted to convert it into cash under false pretenses. Mr. Finley swallowed hard. He looked at the documents, then at me. The fight went out of him completely. He knew his case had just evaporated. He turned to Susan, his voice dropping to a pragmatic whisper. Our only play now is treatment, he said, not even trying to hide it from me or the prosecutor. A long-term inpatient program. It's the only deal they'll offer, and if Kyle's smart, he'll take it. Susan just stared at me, her face a pale mask of dawning horror. It wasn't anger anymore. It was comprehension. She finally understood that this wasn't about my confusion or my grief. It was about my clarity. She saw the trap in all its terrible, intricate detail. She saw that she had no moves left on the board. I had taken her queen, and she hadn't even known we were playing chess. In that moment, I wasn't her mother anymore. I was the architect of her son's fate, and she was utterly, completely powerless to stop me. Kyle took the deal. He had no choice. A year in a state-run, mandatory rehabilitation facility, 2 hours away. The charges of grand larceny and fraud are being held in abeyance. If he completes the program successfully, they'll be reduced to a misdemeanor with probation. If he fails, he faces 5 to 7 years in prison. Tiffany, whose family was not involved, was not offered such a deal. She pleaded guilty and is serving 18 months in a state correctional facility. The system, for all its flaws, can be brutally efficient when it has a clear-cut case. I visit Kyle once a month. The first few visits were hard. He sat across from me in that sterile room, vibrating with a rage so palpable I could feel it from across the table. He called me every name you can imagine. He told me I had ruined his life. I just sat there and let him. I let him pour all the poison out. I had to. It was part of the process. But last month, something shifted. He was quiet. He looked healthier. He had gained some weight, and the light was starting to return to his eyes. He looked at me, his hands steady on the table, and said, "I hate you for what you did, Grandma." I nodded. "I know you do, Kyle," but he said, and he had to stop and take a breath. "The doctor here, he told me something. He said that addiction is like being in a burning building, and that sometimes you have to be thrown out of a third-story window to be saved from the fire. He said it hurts like hell, but it's better than burning to death." He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw my grandson again. "You threw me out the window, didn't you?" "Yes," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I did." He just nodded, and we sat in silence for a while. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it was a real one. It was a start. My relationship with my daughter, Susan, is gone. She has not spoken a word to me since that day in the prosecutor's office. She sends me texts sometimes, clipped and vicious messages, telling me I'm a monster, that I've destroyed our family. Maybe she's right. Maybe I did. But her definition of family was a toxic ecosystem of enabling and denial, and it was killing her son. I had to burn it to the ground to save him. That is a pain I carry with me every single day. It's a wound that I don't think will ever fully heal. Last night, I went to the bank and brought Arthur's collection home. I sat on my bed and opened the heavy mahogany box. I picked up the Art Deco sapphire ring and slid it onto my finger. It felt cool and heavy and real. It didn't feel tainted by what I had done. It felt consecrated. It was a symbol of a love so strong it had reached across death to protect the future. Sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is to become the villain in someone else's story. It wasn't about revenge, not in the end. It was about a war. It was me against the addiction that was trying to claim my grandson's soul. And in a war, you don't always get to fight with honor. Sometimes you have to be cunning. You have to be ruthless. You have to be willing to set a trap to save one of your own. Was I right to do it? I ask myself that question every morning when I wake up and every night before I fall asleep. But then I get a letter in the mail with a return address from the rehabilitation center. It's from Kyle, and it's written in a clear, steady hand. And in that moment, I know I did the only thing a grandmother who loved her grandson could do. I threw him out of the burning building. What would you have done in my position? Is there a line you would never cross, even for someone you love? I'd be interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for listening.